this way for a few reasons, but we are also doing it as a trial. I want to sort of see how this works out moving forward. And, depending on how this works, we might have more of these live sessions for the videos. And of course, it's being recorded. So, it should be possible for everyone to see it later as well. All right. So just a couple of quick things regarding how we are going to do this. I will be doing, partly a presentation, but it's not a very long presentation. It's just sort of an overview of some concepts. And after that, I will basically be going through a bit of a demo, right, of some code that hopefully serves to illustrate some of the ideas that I'm talking about in the initial part of the talk. Now, the way that I think we can take this forward is that, let's try and keep it reasonably interactive, okay, which means that you are pretty much free to ask questions at any point, okay. Although the one catch over there is because I'm trying to present and at the same time also talking, right? I'm not sure how quickly I will be able to pick up on the questions. Now, in any case, this talk that I have got is reasonably structured into sort of parts, right? Meaning that, initially there is a presentation and then afterwards there are like multiple implementations that I will be walking through. After each one of them, I will be sort of pausing, right? So we can definitely sort of take questions and so on at that point, right? If there is something that is unclear, then you are welcome to, raise your hand or even, just sort of unmute and talk if necessary. Please avoid unmuting directly. For the most part, if you raise your hand, I think I will be able to pick it up, or I would request Abhishek or one of the other co-instructors to, just alert me to it in case I haven't noticed it. But I think for the most part, I would like to see if this can be kept sort of reasonably interactive. As of now, we have somewhere around 50 participants, which is still fine. It's not too large a number. As long as all of you remain on mute, unless you have a specific question to ask, I think we should be fine. Okay. So, like I said, because I will be switching between the presentation and talking over here, I'm going to turn off the video from my side, but get started with the presentation. Before we start, are there any specific questions or anything anybody would like to ask as we move forward? One request is that, let's keep the questions to start with, at least focused on today's topic. At the end of the session, depending on time, I am happy to take further questions if needed. Okay. All right. Abhishek, if there is anything I have missed or anything like that, please let me know at any point. Otherwise, we'll just continue.
Sure, sir. I guess that would be a better model. I think everyone should remain on mute. And if in case anyone wants to ask anything, they can just raise their hands. And if you can notice this, that would be okay. But if you are not able to notice at that moment, or maybe for some time, we will alert you at that moment.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right. So let's get started. Just give me one moment, please. Yes, I'm back. Okay, so today's topic is basically we are going to be talking about what it means, or rather different techniques and different concepts that are associated with the idea of implementing a front end. Okay, so from MAD 1, essentially, we have already, in MAD 1, we primarily focused on the so-called backend and the application logic itself, right? I mean, we have some code written in Python, Flask, right, that allows us to implement database connectivity, the HTTP server functionality, the controller, right, and the different views, which of course we did using templates, Jinja templates in the case of MAD 1. And as you know, we had already discussed that in MAD 2, one of the things we are going to do is look a little bit deeper into the front end, right, and see some few more techniques by which you can get a better user experience in terms of what can happen on the front end. Okay. So first things first, what do we mean by the front end, right? And in this context, what I'm saying is this is the user facing part of an app. Okay. It usually you'll see these terms user interface, which is UI, and user experience, which is UX, coming up very often in conversation, right? Or when you're reading on any articles. And ultimately, that's the important part. The user is very important as far as the front end is concerned. Okay. And it's sort of easy to dismiss it and say that, oh, it's like, it's just about making it look fancy, but that's not really the case. The point is a good user interface and a good user experience can make the difference between an app that somebody will actually use versus something that has great functionality, but nobody is interested in actually using it. One very important thing to keep in mind over here is a good user interface is not the same thing as a fancy user interface. Okay. In fact, one of the most powerful and good user interfaces in existence is the so-called command line, right? So those of you who have used the Linux command line would be familiar with that. You know that, you can just type in commands. You can sort of have multiple commands, each of which does a specific kind of operation. And using that command line interface, the terminal, you can chain those commands together, right? And create like really complex and interesting kinds of functionality. Now, almost nobody, right, except a diehard Linux fan, is going to say that that's a beautiful interface. Okay. But on the other hand, it is a really good interface from the point of view of what it achieves and how elegantly it achieves it. Right. So in my opinion, at least, it is an example of what you could call an elegant interface. Right. It just does what is required without anything ultra fancy about it and in a very efficient manner. Okay. So the fact that a user interface does not necessarily mean anything fancy, but is the important part is how effective it is at being usable. That's the main part that we are interested in. Now, what are the requirements that we typically have from the front end? Okay. And one thing that we can sort of say over here is we would prefer that we avoid any complex logic. Right? What I mean by complex logic is anything which is the application logic, anything which needs to do computations, anything which needs to do sort of detailed comparisons and selections of different parts of the database. All that should not be in the front end. Okay, there should be some way by which the application logic can be sort of pushed nicely to the server where the data is stored, and the front end only sort of makes data requests to the server, and its only job is to portray the result of that request. Okay. Now, what we would also prefer is that you don't really store any of the application data at the front end. Okay. As far as possible. And the reason for that is because, at least the way that we are considering with web apps and so on, it is entirely possible that our connection gets cut or something else happens, which essentially results in loss of the communication between where we are looking at the application and what is happening on the server, right? And we already know that HTTP is a stateless protocol. And what we mean by a stateless protocol is that the messages that are exchanged between the client and the server do not by themselves depend on the state of the system. Okay, that is not the same as saying that you cannot implement that, it is impossible to have state in an HTTP based system. It's just that the protocol by itself is stateless, which means that if you want to sort of give the illusion that, the system has some memory and knows who you are or what you were doing, there have to be some other ways of doing it, which is not just part of the normal protocol itself. Okay. So these are all sort of requirements that we would like to see in a front end framework, for want of a better word, right? And there are also certain desirable aspects to it. One of them is that it should be aesthetically pleasing, right? I just gave you an example of something which a lot of people may not normally consider aesthetically pleasing, the command line, but that also depends on, where you're coming from and what you are used to, right? The point is, it does not have any, what I mean by the aesthetically pleasing is when you look at it, you should not be sort of turned off. You should not see like ugly looking fonts and things of that sort, or colors which are just jarring, which essentially make you feel, okay, I don't want to use this particular application, right? It's sort of obvious, it's intuitive, but it's something that a lot of people miss. Okay. Now, the next thing is responsive. And what I mean by responsive over here is probably a little different from the context, from the word responsive as used in the context of CSS. What I mean is that an application is considered responsive when it responds to your interaction very quickly, right? Let's say that you input something, there is pretty much an immediate response to what you do. You click somewhere on the screen, there is an immediate response. Okay. Normally in CSS, responsive is used in order to indicate something else, which is the next word that I've got, which is that it's adaptive, right? If you have different sort of outputs, different screen sizes, different kinds of monitors, whatever it is on which you are displaying, then you would like your user application to also adapt nicely to those contexts, right? And in very often in the context of CSS, at least, that word responsive is sometimes used to mean adaptive. I'm using it in this with these meanings over here. Okay. So now all of these are sort of things that we would like to see in a front end, right? Now, how do we achieve this? Okay. And in a large part, what we are going to do this week, as well as in the next couple of weeks, is sort of show different ways by which we can use one particular framework in order to achieve a lot of these things and to have a nice sort of way of building up a good user interface. Okay. And there is one concept over here, which again, you would probably have come across in other contexts, right? Basically while talking about programming languages. And this is more to do actually with something called a programming style. You might also have heard of this as programming languages, right? There is something called an imperative style of programming, and there is something else called a declarative style of programming, right? And there are other styles as well, but these are the important ones for our purposes right now. Okay. Now, what I mean by imperative programming is that if you want to achieve a certain result, right, you literally specify the sequence of actions that have to be taken, right, by the computer in order to achieve that final result. Okay. So let's say that I want to have something on the screen, right, where there is a navigation bar, right? There is a footer, there is some kind of a sidebar, then there is some date module somewhere on a corner, and then there is one blob of text over here. There is a picture somewhere over here, right? This, let's say, is the final output that I want to see, right? In an imperative style of programming, literally the way that I would do it is look at the screen, right? And now in the top, whatever, let's say 100 pixels of the screen, go and draw a box. Make that and within that box, go and enter this text, which is the left arrow for going back, right arrow for going forward, some link for going to the home page, etc. Type in all of those things. So there will be probably one function, which as you run through the steps of the function, will actually go through and draw the navigation bar. Okay. Then after that, I will have another function which basically says, okay, go through and draw the things corresponding to the footer. Then another one for the sidebar, then another one for the picture, and so on. Okay. So imperative programs will basically go through this process of running the steps one by one and will draw whatever you want on the screen. Okay. Now, for things like user interfaces, it is often considered that there is a slightly better way of achieving this result, where the programmer doesn't go around giving the sequence of steps. What the programmer says is basically draw this picture, right? You say that at the top, there should be a navigation bar. At the bottom, there should be a footer. On the left, there should be a sidebar. In the middle, there should be text, right? And there will be some kind of a compiler or an interpreter, some intermediate piece of code, which understands what you are trying to do and achieves all of these results. Okay. So declarative programming allows the programmer to sort of concentrate on what their final result should look like, rather than how to achieve that result. Okay. So that's the primary difference that we are talking about over here. In declarative programming, you try and specify what you want the final result to be, right? Whereas in imperative programming, you give the exact sequence of steps. How should you go about computing something? Okay. Now, if you take a step back and think purely in terms of programming languages or arbitrary programs, right? Let's say that I'm trying to implement some kind of a climate simulation or something of that sort, right? Over there, using an imperative style of programming probably makes more sense, right? Because literally I have a sequence of actions to follow. I basically say, okay, I have all this data corresponding to climate information, right? Maybe temperatures, pressures, air pressure, latitudes, longitudes, all of those things. Read all of them, right? Construct a model for that, and then go through a time simulation where I say, okay, I'm basically doing some kind of numerical integration in order to find out how the system will evolve with time. Okay, so it makes sense to specify it in full detail. Whereas when you're talking about something like a user interface, then specifying it in full detail like this may not really be the best way to go about doing things, right? Instead, you sort of broadly say, okay, I want to have a navigation bar, I want to have a footer, I want to have a sidebar, and let some other system take care of making sure that all of those things are delivered and kept up to date. Okay, so this whole business of that declarative programming style is something that we will be sort of looking at more and more, and we will be understanding in the context of how we are building up front ends over here. So this is actually a nice picture which I have taken from the Flutter documentation. Flutter, for those of you who don't know it, is a separate SDK. It's a software development kit, right? And is in fact in another programming language called Dart, right? So this basically comes from Google, and it was originally developed sort of for Android, but also the whole point of Flutter is that it is cross-platform, meaning that in principle, at least if you develop something using Flutter, it should work on Android, it should work on iOS, right? And probably also on, I believe it has targets even for, the desktops and so on, right? Now, Flutter is a very good platform, a very good software development kit, but that's not our focus over here. We don't want to sort of get sidetracked and go into understanding Flutter. It's a bit more complicated. What we have been trying throughout this course is to look at what are simple enough platforms that can give you an idea of what we are trying to convey over here, right? So that the concepts come through, and then you should be able to apply these same concepts in other programming languages or in other SDKs as well. Okay, so what is this picture that we have got? And in fact, you can look at the page that from where I got this. Essentially, it's in part of the documentation that says start thinking declaratively, right? And what they are saying is that for user interfaces, using this declarative style of programming is preferable. It is probably the best way to go about building your system. Okay. Now, what is this equation, right? Essentially, it's telling you that there is something over here called the application state. Okay. And understanding what exactly application state means is a very important part of how you go about designing not just an application, but its user interface as well. Okay. And in this case, what they're saying is once you have the application state, you apply a set of functions to it, which they are calling your build methods, right? And that should result in the layout as seen on the screen. Okay. What exactly does this mean? What it seems to be saying is that there is some magical, entity called state, which once I know what the state of the application is, then the user interface should be uniquely determined, because after all, I'm just applying a function to it and getting that final user interface output. Okay. So what exactly do we mean by state? That is something that's quite important to understand clearly. To put it quite simply, the state is essentially the memory of the system. Okay, it consists of all internal details of the system. It basically says everything that is required in order to reproduce a given state of the system. Okay, I use the word given state of the system, so it sounds like a circular definition, but effectively what I'm saying over here is, if you have a specific set of things in the memory, right? That includes the database, that includes what has been clicked on the screen, that includes pretty much everything that you can think about the system at any given point in time, you should be able to get back and reproduce this exact same state somewhere else. Okay. And what that equation that I just showed you, right, UI is equal to f of state, is telling you is that given a particular system state, the system should always respond the same way to further inputs. That is, it should show you the same user interface and then respond the same way to further inputs. Okay. Now, it is possible to think of applications that do not require any internal state, right? Where there is no concept of state. You don't need to really store anything. The user interface is just, always constant. But that effectively becomes a kind of trivial application. It's just a static page, right? Without any sort of variation at all in it, right? Whereas anything that you can think of as an application needs some kind of internal state to be effective and useful. Okay. So let's look at a few more examples, right? So I'm using this term system state. It is again something which you may not commonly come across in multiple places. But what the system state is saying is, at least what I mean by system state is pretty much everything that describes the system, right? So for example, if I'm looking at something like Amazon.in or Flipkart.com, right? They have a complete database of available items, the prices, who are the registered users, who are the ones who are currently logged in. All of that information is stored somewhere in their databases, right? The databases themselves may be distributed. They may be split among multiple types of databases, right? But at the end of the day, if I have all of that information available to me, I make a copy of that, I can reproduce the exact system somewhere else. Right? Similarly, if I look at Times of India as a newspaper website, or the Hindu or the BBC, whatever it is, right? I can basically get all the news articles they have ever published and also have some information about them. All that put together would constitute the system state of that particular website. Right? For something like NPTEL or the online degree course, right? All the students who are registered, all their courses, the marks, certificates, all of that information put together constitutes the system state. Okay. Now, it's not very clear what you do with something like this. It's not that I can actually ask what is the state of this system, because it is huge, right? For any non-trivial application, this is huge because among other things, it constitutes the entire database that the system has, right? And the important point over here is, if you look at this system state, it is actually completely independent of the user interface. That is, it does not depend on who is looking at it or what you are seeing or how your web page looks like. This is just background information that is required for reproducing the system at any given point in time. Okay. So from the point of view of a front-end developer, this is important to know. You need to know where your data is. But on the other hand, it does not directly affect how you design your application, right? Instead, what we have is something else called application state. Okay. Now, application state is the application. It's once again the system as seen by an individual user. Okay. And examples of this would be, on Amazon or Flipkart, it's your shopping cart, right? What are the items that you have put into your shopping cart? Similarly, do you have any user preferences, right? Do you want to pay in Indian rupees or in US dollars, right? On some cases, it might even just be the theme of the thing, right? On Gmail, for example, maybe you have chosen to have a different theme than the default, right? All of that is part of the application state. In other words, when I look at generating the user interface, I need to know these pieces of information. I need to know what is the choice of theme that this person has. Right? What kind of user preferences do they have? What font? Well, probably not the font, but at least like in which style do they want to see the date displayed, for example, right? All of those things are user preferences, shopping carts. All of that information is required in order for me to generate what the output user interface looks like. Right? Similarly, when I log into one of my news websites, I might find that the recommended news items for me are based on my past preferences. What are the things that I like to read? Okay. Or else you might have a dashboard kind of a display, right? Something which basically says, okay, these are all the courses that you're registered for, or maybe on NPTEL, these are the courses that are currently running, number of students registered, the state of the course, have any quizzes been conducted, all of that information is application state. And now this becomes important from the point of view of the front-end designer, because I need to know what is the information I need to be present in this state and how it will impact my user interface. Okay. And finally, there is something else which is called UI state. Once again, in the case of Flutter, they use this term ephemeral state. Okay. Now, ephemeral, the dictionary definition of this is basically something that lasts for a very short time. Okay. And this is a term, in fact, used by Flutter. It makes a lot of sense. Effectively, what it's saying is that it is the part of the application that is actually being interacted with. Okay. So let's say that you are loading a particular page. There might be some spinner icon that shows that currently loading, right? Or something else which has a progress bar that says this much has been loaded, right? That has no real impact on the functionality of the system, right? Mostly it is just something which is required for you to display something properly. But even if that information is lost, right, it does not have any long-term impact on the functionality of the system. Okay, so there might be, for example, on Wikipedia, there is a talk page versus, well, no, that's not really the best option, but there are some of these websites on which you might have multiple tabs that you can select, right? And depending on which tab you select, it will show you different pieces of information. Now, which is the currently selected tab will determine what is shown on the screen, but it's again just a short-term piece of information. It doesn't have any long-term effect on what you are, on how the application actually behaves. Okay, so these two things, this application state and ephemeral state, are important to keep in mind when you are going around designing an application and the front end corresponding to that. Okay, so now with all of that, so hopefully that sort of makes it clear what we mean by state as such in a system, right? Now, all this sounds good, but one of the fundamental principles of HTTP is that HTTP by itself is stateless. In other words, the protocol is stateless. Okay, the protocol does not have any way of remembering what the application state is, right? The protocol only allows you to define things like get and post and similar requests. And the server then, based on those, right, will be able to send back some information. Now, in addition to that, the server might also get some more information, such as, for example, what cookies have been set or which IP address you are coming from, right? And it then has to infer something about the state of the client, right? Including things like, are you logged in? That will probably depend on some cookie or the other, right? Or it might depend on some other information which is somehow passed between the client and the server separately. Okay, I mean, it is passed over some HTTP request, but it is not part of the protocol itself. Okay, this is something that it's sort of well worth thinking about clearly and understanding, right? Why we keep on and on about HTTP being stateless is that there are other transport protocols that are stateful. Okay, where the protocol itself might say, okay, currently I'm in a state where I can accept certain kind of requests, or currently I'm in a state where you're only allowed to sort of close the connection, or currently I'm in a state where you can send an image, right? You could have a kind of protocol that allows you to do something of that sort, where the protocol itself also sets up some extra information between the client and the server. HTTP does not do that. In HTTP, every request is more or less independent of the previous request or previous set of requests, right? And only by sort of keeping track of how the requests were made one after the other can the server sort of build up a picture of where the client is and thereby decide how to respond. Okay. So with that background, what it means is that if you want to convey some state between the client and the server, one possibility is that the client maintains an idea of what the application state is, right? And what the user interface looks like. And based on the application state that it knows, it sends requests to the server for specific items and updates those items on the screen. Right? The other possibility is that the client is a pure, completely sort of a dumb client, so to say, right? Something which does not have any processing capabilities of its own, right? And the server maintains the complete state of the system. It shows the client what kind of requests it is allowed to make at any given point in time by probably putting them in URLs. And depending on which URL is clicked, the server will then decide what to show next and sends the entire information back to the client. Okay, so these are sort of the two extreme ways by which you can convey state and sort of have a concept of state and convey it between a client and the server, right? And in actual front ends, what you will find is that, you are trying to do something in between these. Okay. So what I'm going to do next is, in order to explain all of this, right, I'm going to take one particular example, which is tic-tac-toe. Okay, so what is tic-tac-toe? It's basically noughts and crosses, X and O, right? You would have come across it at some point in time. Essentially, what we have is there will be a grid of this sort, which is displayed on the screen, right? We assume that X is going to play first. So let's say, so what the user interface should do is it should allow the person to indicate either an X or an O marker, right? As soon as X has played, the next turn goes to O, right? And let's say that O plays over here. After that, X plays somewhere else. Let's say that O plays in some other location. Finally, X comes over here, and at this point, it should say, okay, X wins, right? Or O wins, or it's a draw, right? Because it's entirely possible that you could also have a draw, right? Neither side is winning. So the game itself is very simple, but we'll look at what exactly it means to sort of, what are the things that you need to maintain as the state of the system, different ways by which this can be implemented, and where the state of the system is being recorded corresponding to those. And we will use this in order to motivate one particular front end that we are going to be using moving forward, which is Vue.js. Okay. Now, some of you may already be familiar with some parts of Vue.js, or you may be really comfortable with programming in Vue.js. We are going to be sort of taking baby steps in that direction, right? We are going to be using Vue.js in a very restricted manner. Okay. And one thing that I would request is, those who have prior experience with Vue.js, you might be used to using the command line interface and using like various modules and so on in Vue.js. That's not what we are looking for over here, right? I am primarily using Vue as a platform for indicating certain basic concepts. So, and I am not an expert in Vue.js. Tejesh, the other instructor, is like much more experienced with it. But the point that we are trying to make over here is, what we are trying to teach is not advanced Vue usage, right? What we are trying to do is to focus on concepts. What is it that Vue can and cannot do? And how do you sort of use it in order to build good applications? Okay, so I can take a small break over here because after this, I'm switching over to the demos. If you have any questions, if anything is there, this would be a good time to ask. Yes, somebody has raised hand. Shreyash.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, good evening.
I have a question on front-end part. We discussed on designing the front-end or aesthetics, how the web page should look like, right? But while developing that, there are certain decisions where we have to take. For example, for some people, having header always there could be and easy to navigate. But for some, it could contain it could consume the web page space.
Okay.
Or for some, navigating through the left-hand panel would be comfortable, but for some, having wide area to view would be comfortable. So how do we decide on those platforms?
I mean, that's a good question. I think there have been a few PhD theses published on this topic. There's no simple answer. It completely depends on your application. And the problem is, it's not just on the application. It also depends on the person, right? So like you rightly pointed out, it's not just, and there might be certain applications for which it makes sense to have, a large header or something of that sort, but then it might also be personal preference, right? Because for example, I mean, nowadays I see that pretty much every website that I look at has one huge big image right on top. It's called that banner, the Jumbotron or whatever it is, right? I mean, that seems to be the design style of the day, right? Have a nice big Jumbotron picture over there, which sort of is supposed to convey something about your company or whatever it is. And as you scroll down, the further information sort of slides into view. Now, I actually find that a bit irritating, right? I don't particularly like that, but then that's my personal preference, right? So how do you sort of answer this in general? A lot of it is just based on experience, but there are websites that actually talk about good guidelines, right? So in MAD 1, actually, sorry, application development 1, I had actually talked about, I think, Nielsen, Jacob Nielsen's guidelines for UI design, right? And there is also, I mean, there are a few websites that talk about this. Another thing to keep in mind is the W3 consortium, right? World Wide Web Consortium. They have their accessibility guidelines. Those are all good things to keep in mind, right? Which generally are useful for people who are interested in, having usable, good user interface. But yeah, beyond that, there's no sort of clear-cut thing saying, okay, this is the right way or this is not the right way to do it. Okay, so it's completely sort of dependent on what you are trying to do.
Right. And also, so continuing with that, how do we measure the page loading time? Because it also has some variable parameters that varies from user to user. So is there any standard?
Again, see, there is no standard that you can put over there, right? You need to finally look at it by saying, at the end of the day, whoever is my user should have a good user experience, right? It's no use if you tell people that I have I measured like whatever, some 100 on light speed or something of that sort, right? But the user finally, when they try loading your web page, it turns out that their experience is slow. Now, in some cases, it is not in your control. It might be that the user has a poor or low bandwidth or high latency connection. And, there's nothing that you can do about that. Although, I mean, even there are some tests that can be done, which sort of say that, even if the user has a low bandwidth connection, how should you improve the performance and so on. But otherwise, it's not like this is some kind of a scoring game where you just say, hey, I had a very good score. Why are you saying that my website is bad? Nobody really cares about the score beyond a point. What they do care about is what does it actually feel like when they are trying to load your page. Okay. So all of these things, like, I mean, how do you measure it? You have to measure, well, worst case is probably one thing that you need to do, or you might have to look at some kind of average or median or something of that sort. But you need to set your metrics and say that for these kind of users, I will have, this kind of good performance and so on. Is that
right?
Your question?
Yes, sir, that clarifies. Also, sir, can we, what we show on the screen, can we decide that on the parameter, what is the bandwidth of user? Like Google AMP, that the fast loading?
Yeah, I mean, it can be done, right? So definitely it is possible. I mean, so forget about AMP. AMP, I think, is something specific for accelerated mobile pages. And there are some controversies also regarding that, right? I mean, people felt that it becomes too Google specific and so on. But even if you look at the Google Gmail web page, right, they have handled it in a very simple manner, right? When you are opening gmail.com, you will see that at the bottom, initially, there is one thing which says, click here for standard HTML for slow connections, right? So if the user can then take that decision. If they find that it's not loading quickly enough for them, they just click on that, and yes, they get something which is like pure HTML with very little JavaScript or no JavaScript, and loads much faster. Okay, so that kind of thing you can choose. Either you can leave it to the user to select the low bandwidth version of the page, or you can say that you will try and detect somehow how long it took them. I mean, but that's not easy, right? Because mostly your communication is one way. You are sending information to the user. It's not very easy to sort of get the round trip time and find out how quickly they got it and so on. There are ways of doing it, but that becomes much more invasive, right? But if you do have that information saying that a user is on a slow connection, then maybe you can actually on the server side itself change and maybe either don't send some images or send smaller images. Lots of options are there to you as a designer.
Right. So as a designer or developer, we have to strike a balance between the scripts we use, because that imperatively, what I can understand is reduces the page loading time.
Wait, what was that about imperative?
The more scripts we use, it hampers the page loading time.
Yeah, in general, yes. I can't think of any reason where running more scripts would help. So yeah, generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, having fewer scripts will probably be a good idea. But that's not the only thing. I mean, if you're still sending large images, or you have something else which makes your loading slow, that can also cause problems. Okay, so let's. Yeah, go ahead.
So I want to ask, can we just not use stateful protocols everywhere rather than stateless?
Why would you want to use stateful protocols?
They carry almost all the information around the system.
No, but see, you have to sort of think back about how and in what context HTTP was designed in the first place, right? See, the internet by itself is, I mean, it is subject to broken connections, right? Even like whatever, nearly 30 years after the design of HTTP, we still have the problem of connection dropped or connection lost, things of that sort happening, right? Either you're on a mobile phone and you get into a bad signal area, or your power goes off at home and your Wi-Fi gets cut, right? So now if you have a stateful protocol, that causes lots of problems, because what happens in a stateful protocol is that you have built up something, the protocol knows exactly where you are, and now suddenly it is not getting requests that it expected to see, right? And let's say that your connection goes for, let's say, 5 minutes and then comes back. What is the state of your connection, right? Because let's say that your phone rebooted, okay, or your desktop computer rebooted, then what is the state of the connection? Because the desktop doesn't know the state of the connection anymore. The server thinks that it is in a certain state, right? So stateful protocols are usually avoided in general for network related things, unless you have a very strong way of guaranteeing that the connection will not be easily lost. You can still recover, right? I mean, let's say that a server gets some bad request in the case of a stateful protocol, then it will have to start falling back saying, okay, now, this did not make sense. Let me go and reestablish the connection and recreate the state from the beginning. Okay. But usually the overhead associated with that is just too much. It's not worth it, because, there are so many people trying to connect, and trying to sort of maintain state like this for each and everyone is not worth it. So you usually look for better or other alternative ways of maintaining state.
Okay.
All right, so let me switch over to my other screen. Okay. Okay, sorry about this. Sorry, I think I may have temporarily disconnected. All right, let me just share the screen and be done with it. I think it's easier. Okay. I hope you can see my screen. The problem is that now I can't really see what is there. So Abhishek, I would rely on you to let me know if there's any problem here.
Yeah, sure. Sir.
Yeah. All right. So let's get to what I'm going to do over here is look at basically 4 different implementations of this tic-tac-toe program, right? So what is tic-tac-toe? Essentially, what we want is to have something where there is a board, right, which has 9 entries in it. And each time we want to be switching between a X and an O and allow the person to click on it. Okay. So I'm going to start with a very basic Python-based implementation, right? I'm using Flask over here, right? And what I'm doing is I'm basically, this is a very trivial kind of Flask application, but it makes sense because Flask allows you to write trivial applications, right? Now, let's look at these 2 lines over here, line 3 and line 4, right? Where essentially I'm defining my board. Okay. Now, how have I done it? If you look at this, this bracket 0 star 9, essentially what it's saying is that I'm creating a list of 9 0 entries. Okay. It's just a shortcut. I could have written this as 0, 0, 0. Also, it would have worked exactly the same way. And I also have this next, which is a global variable, right? Both of these, board and next, are global variables. The initial state of board is all zeros, and next has the value 1, right? And as I put in on the comment over here, 1 corresponds to X, minus 1 corresponds to 0. I could have directly, instead chosen to have X and O itself as the entries over there. I just did this because it made my life slightly easier when I was trying to check whether the game is completed or not. Okay. So this is in other words, these 2 lines, right? This line 3 and line 4, the 2 variables that we have over here, board and next, they essentially correspond to the application state. Okay, so this, in the context of this very trivial example, is what I mean by application state. Okay, now with all of that, and why have I declared it as a global variable? Because it has to be seen by multiple different things that are there in the application. Okay, is this the only way of doing it? There may have been better ways by which I can sort of, have a board and a next variable and have them being shared across different parts of this. The problem is that, first of all, I'm not like trying to complicate the thing over here. I'm just using something simple that works, right? And in this case, because I need to be able to access it from multiple different sort of URLs in my Flask application, I'm just declaring them as globals. It makes life easier. Okay. Now, the application itself is started like this. I just set a static folder and a template folder. And then I say that take the /root, that is to say when I start this application, right? And I define a function homepage, and all that it does is it renders a template, right? Which is this file tic.html. It passes in 2 variables into it. One is the board and the other is the next value. Okay. Now inside tic.html, what do I have? This is a generic sort of HTML template, right? It has the basic tags over here. If I look at this part, right, there is the head part of it just has a little bit of CSS styling, not too much, right? Just something which changes the background color. You could get rid of this. It's not really crucial in any way to how the system works, right? Now, inside the main body, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have one header, which basically says this is the next move, right? And that next move will have a little bit of Jinja code in it, which basically selects which image is to be shown. Okay, so there are 3 images that I have stored somewhere in my system. And depending on what the value of this next variable is, right? If it was -1, I will show O. If it was 0, I will show B. And if it was 1, I will show X. Okay. So I've just basically created one small array and then just indexed into it. Just, using a little bit of Python's, writing it compactly in Python. That's all. But then after that, how do I actually display the X and O grid, right? For that, what I'm doing is I create a table because that seems to be a fairly reasonable way of making a grid. It's not the best way, right? And in fact, later on, we will see a slightly better, cleaner way of making a grid, but it works, right? I mean, this is good enough for what we have. Now I've set a few things, right? I basically specify the border, and then after that, I have a whole bunch of Jinja code over here, right? Which, at least in my understanding, turns out to be necessary in order to get the logic implemented properly. Okay. Now, could this have been done better? Quite possibly, right? It's possible that you might have come up with a more compact way of doing it, or you could even have pushed some of this computation out into the Python code itself, right? And got back something which was much easier for the Jinja to display, right? So it's not my purpose to sort of, and one thing that you need to be very clear about is I am not at any stretch claiming that this is the most efficient or a clean implementation of the code. Okay, it's fairly compact, good enough for our purposes, but that's about it. And my purpose over here is not to sort of show that the Python style is better or the JavaScript style is better or Vue.js is better. I'm just showing them as different options. So anyway, I have a bunch of Jinja code over here. I set up the rows, and within that, I have another loop that sets up the individual table data entries, right? And in this, you will see that there is some logic, which basically says that if the current entry in any square is 0, I will convert that particular thing into a link, right? And whichever way it is, I will basically display something which corresponds to whatever is this present SP class, that is O or B or X. Okay. And every, whenever C is equal to 0, I start a new row, and whenever C is equal to 2, I end a row, right? So that way I will basically get a table with 3 rows in it. Each row will therefore have 3 columns. Okay. Now let me go back over here. In my app.py. In other words, what it says is, with this home page, it will render tic.html. Let's take a look and see what that looks like. Okay. So I have my Python environment already set up. And what I do is I just run python app.py, right? And of course, it gives me the warnings. This is a development server and so on. And when I click on that link and open it, it brings up the browser, which basically has, the headline as I expected, next move is X. And it has created a table. And you will see that each of these things basically corresponds to a URL. Okay, these are clickable links. So in other words, everything over here has become a clickable link. Okay. And you will see as I hover over it, I hope you can see the link at the bottom. The top left basically says set/0, set/1, set/2, set/3, and so on. Right. So each one of these is sort of going to the set endpoint, but with a different parameter, 0 to 8. Right. So now let's look at how we get the functionality for set. And what I'm going to say is I will define a new function in my Python code, set value. I call up the global board and next variables, right? I have to declare them as globals over here because I'm actually going to change their value. If I don't declare this global, I will end up creating a local variable and modifying its value, which is not what I want in this case, right? So you have to be careful to actually explicitly declare this as global over here. So what I'm going to do is very simple. I just say that board of I, whichever I is, right? Set/0 would basically set the element number 0, board of 0 to be the value next. And because I chose 1 and -1, the next equal to minus next is sufficient. I don't need to check whether it is currently X and then make it O and so on, right? After that, I have this additional function check state of board. I'll get to that later, right? Let's ignore it for now. Now, what it says is, you can sort of imagine what is happening over here. R is equal to check state of board. The idea is that if R is equal to 0, right, as we will see later when we go through the check state function, I will basically redirect back to the home page /. Okay. So now let me see what that implies in terms of this. Let's say I go and click over here, set/0. Okay. It immediately changes it to an X. And now you will see that because of the Jinja template, right, this is no longer a link, right? You remember there was this piece of code in tic.html, which checked if E is equal to 0, and only then it allowed you to make it a link. Okay. Same way I can go through over here. I have some other options, right? I do all of this. And now I have something which the moment I click over here, it basically says congratulations. In other words, it has detected that O1, right? And it also provides me with a new link for play again, right? So how does that part work? I need to define this function check state, which basically looks through all possible patterns where you could have a winning order, right? That is entries number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These are the horizontal rows. 0, 3, 6, 1, 4, 7, 2, 5, 8. These are the vertical columns. 0, 4, 8 and 2, 4, 6 are the diagonals. In every one of these patterns, it basically just adds up the values which are there in that pattern. And if the result is 3, it says x1. If it is minus 3, it says o1. Otherwise, it sets r equal to 0, right? Okay, I mean, it doesn't need this r equal to 0. It just sort of goes through the board. If any entry in the board is currently 0, it immediately says game is still in progress. Otherwise, it returns 2 for a draw. Okay. Now, what the set value function does is it basically checks whether r is equal to 0. If so, the game is still in progress. Otherwise, it renders the end.html template. Now, was this necessary? I could probably have done it with the same tic.html itself, right? I don't think it was necessary to have a separate end.html because if you look at it, it's more or less the same as what tic.html had, right? So, but I was being lazy. I didn't really bother to refactor or reduce that. So this is how I have done it, right? Now, how does that work? If I click on play again, I can then basically go through and say, yeah, let me just make sure. Oh no, unfortunately, x1. Okay. I need to make sure I can't win this. Yeah, so no, unfortunately, it seems to have got some kind of a bug. It should have shown that it's a draw, right? Instead, I've got some message which sort of says that B1. So I've got a small bit of problematic logic over there that I need to fix. Okay, so the bottom line is, let's go back and look at the code itself. Board and next indicated the complete state of the system, right? The application is created, and what it does is it defines these endpoints. There is one basic homepage endpoint, and there is one thing for set. Okay, and the set is used in order to set the value of any given entry in the board. Okay, now let's look at what happens. Of course, I mean, finally, this new game board function over here, the slash new, all that it does is it basically creates a new board, right, and redirects to slash. Okay, so this is also a very simple piece of code. Now, the interesting thing over here is, let's say I do this play again, right, and I play a couple of different things. Now I'm going to reload this page. Okay, I mean, you can't really see it, but it so happens that it reloads instantly, but shows me exactly the same state as before. Now let me do something more interesting. I open one incognito window, right, and put it into that. In other words, this is some other browser. Somebody else is accessing it. I go there and find exactly the same state of the system. Okay, and if I continue doing this over here, right, and then after that close this window, I see that there is something else over here. But when I try clicking on this, it basically, it refreshes the page to the state that is already known by the system. Okay, and then only allows me to continue by clicking on the things that are not already been clicked. Okay, so in other words, by maintaining the entire state on the server side, the client has almost no smart functionality, right? It just has a set of links that can be clicked. Everything is done purely on the server. You can reload the page, you can disconnect, you can go away, come back later, and you will find that the server is still in the correct state that you last left it. Somebody else connects to it. In this case, of course, I mean, they will see the same state. You could change it so that the server looks at, let's say, the IP address from which you are connecting and then shows you a different game or something of that sort. But the bottom line is everything is maintained at the server. Okay. So this is an example of the sort of most trivial form of implementing this entire logic using Python Flask approach. Okay. Are there any questions on this before we move forward to the next one, which is a JavaScript implementation? All right, sounds good. So, right. So now we saw what this looks like in Python, right? Let's go forward and look at the next thing, which is I'm going to try and do the same thing using JavaScript over here. Okay. And first things first, when we have JavaScript, right? What ends up happening is that I need to have an HTML page, right? How does JavaScript work? I basically once again have some HTML. I use the same sort of styling, which was probably not required. Now the thing though is, right, in the body part, I'm doing something slightly different, right? I basically declare one span and give it the ID next. Okay. Now I could have called it something else. I could probably have called it message or something of that sort, right? But you look at it and you realize that it doesn't actually have any data corresponding to it. There's nothing in this. In other words, if I try rendering this HTML page by itself, nothing is going to come up. After that, I declare a table. And inside the table, I find that all that I'm doing is declaring a bunch of spans. Okay, each one of these basically is declared like this. So in other words, the entire table has been put in place explicitly, right? So you can see that it's a 3x3 grid, but there's no logic, there is no content. In other words, if I just look at this HTML page on a browser where JavaScript has been turned off, I will see nothing on the screen. Okay, I could of course have something else maybe which has one dummy span where it basically says, oh, you need to turn on JavaScript. And if JavaScript is present, change the content of that span to be empty or something like that. Okay, that would probably be the cleanest way of saying, okay, you need to have JavaScript enabled in order to view this. Obviously, the entire work of displaying anything is being handled through this last step over here, which is the loading of the JavaScript file. Okay, so I just put that in at the bottom over here. And let me then see what Tic-Tac-Toe.js actually corresponds to. Right? So Tic-Tac-Toe.js, very similar if you look at it, right? I mean, in terms of the pure functionality, pretty much like what was done in the case of Python, right? I have a board declared as a global variable. So you see what's happening here. I have declared all these lets up here at the top of the script, which effectively automatically makes them globals. Okay. I mean, as a general matter of principle, now that we are in, ES 2020 or whatever is the version of JavaScript that we are looking at, right? At least ECMAScript 6 and beyond. I'm not going to be using var anywhere, right? It's pretty much either let or const, depending on what we are trying to do. Okay. You might find that other people use var, but generally speaking, that's to be avoided at this point in time. Okay. So I initialize the board. I initialize the next value to be 1. And I also have one more variable that basically has this thing saying this is the current state of the game. Okay. I have a function that I call reset board. Okay. Which in this case, is basically all that it's doing is once again setting the values of board, next, and gstate to be their initial values, and then calling a function called update page. Right. And this update page is the one where all the work actually happens, right? So it basically looks for this element next and sets the inner HTML of that to be either next move X or next move O, etc. Right? If gstate is equal to 1, that is the X1, then it will basically say yay X1. Otherwise, it will say O1. Otherwise, it will finally say, oh, that was a boring draw. Okay. And it will finally also, at that point alone, it will bring up this button that allows me to click on this thing saying play again. Okay. And what I'm doing over here is I also have one small piece of logic over here that takes those spans, right? What were the spans that we had over there? We had all of these TD0, TD1, etc. These spans. What do I do with them? I get them by ID, TD plus 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. and set the inner HTML of that to be either an X or an O, depending on what it was, and associate an on-click entry with it. Okay. And what does on-click entry, on-click do? It basically calls update entry of 0, 1, 2, 3, whatever is the actual value that you have over there. Now, this check state function is exactly the same as what was there in the Python code, just written in JavaScript this time, right? And you might notice that there is this line over here where I have used one reduce function in JavaScript, right? Just trying to be clever over here. It looks nice. That's all. You could have done it using a for loop or any other way. All would have worked exactly the same. But what does this update entry do? It checks whether the game is still in progress. That is to say, G state is equal to 0, right? And if the current location in the board has a 0 entry, that is, it has not yet become an X or an O. If so, then it sets the value to next. It toggles the value of next, and once again calls this check state function, right? After that, after doing all of this, it calls update page. Okay. And so what have I done? I've basically declared a bunch of functions. There is one helper function out here, which just returns X or O. There is reset board, then there is update page. There is check state and update entry. I've declared a whole bunch of functions. And finally, I just call this reset board. So this is the actual functionality of the board as it happens. Okay. What happens when we try and load this into a browser? Okay. So this is no longer, and we are not interested in the Python version anymore. We are going to look at the JavaScript version. I will directly load it. How do I load it? I need to get this. Yeah. So this is the JavaScript version of my same functionality, right? And as you can see, nothing is there. I mean, I don't see any links. The cursor doesn't change in shape, nothing of that sort. But when I go and click somewhere, it promptly updates. Okay. And then I click here, it updates, it does all of this logic, right? And the moment I do this, it basically says, yeah, O1, right? And it now provides a button, right? So that entire span with next in it now has this thing for play again with the button. It's possible to have got it looking exactly like the Python version, but on the other hand, I didn't really want to. I mean, I've made like slight changes in each one here and there. Right? This is just so that, okay, the moment I click on this button, it once again resets the board and goes back. Okay. If you look at the total amount of code over here, it is almost the same because, you can imagine that the logic for checking the state, for example, is identical, right? The update entry is more or less the same. The messages that are being generated at the top are, they're dominated by the message itself that needs to be sent, right? So nothing really to say that either Python or JavaScript is better. So clearly the changes are somewhere else. Let's see one important change, right? Which is that I've got all this over here. And now what I'm going to do is go and click on reload the page. Okay. It's gone, right? Whatever I had over there is gone and it has been reset to a new board, right? So I go here, I do all of this, right? And at this point, once again, I reload the page. Once again, everything is lost. Okay. And I do some more over here. Let's say that I also create one more page and load it, right? I find that that once again starts with a new page, right? Where once again, I can start playing some more. I go back to the old one. I can still continue on it and it remains where it last left off. Whereas this other one is playing something else. Okay. So I have these two different versions that are effectively, running in parallel with each other, right? And it doesn't matter which one sort of worked first, nothing of that sort. They are effectively playing independently, but the moment I reload the page, I would find that I get reset to the original state. Okay, so what has happened over here? If you look at it, there is actually no server at all involved in this, right? Because look at the URL up here. I have directly loaded it as a file. That was enough for it to load the JavaScript and to execute, right? And the reason it did that is because there was nothing really potentially damaging out here, right? You can't really go and like change any values or do anything else with this, right? So it allows you to straight away run the JavaScript, which is there in that tic-tac-toe.js file, right? The state is completely contained on the browser, which is why when I reload the page, the state gets reset. Okay. If I wanted to communicate this state back to the server, first of all, I need to have a server running, right? And second thing is I would need to think of some other way by which every time I click over here, the state actually goes back to the server. Okay. That is actually part of where the power of JavaScript comes into play, or the asynchronous loads and so on. But we will not be looking at that this week. We will look at it later, right? In terms of how you can implement certain kinds of functionality. For now, the important part is the basic functionality could be implemented completely in JavaScript, but now the entire state is maintained on the client with no knowledge at all for the server. Okay. Now, once again, time for a small break before we move on to the framework, Vue.js. Any questions? Yes, go ahead. Yeah, I think you can just go ahead, unmute and ask, because no, I.
Yeah, good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, sir, this asynchronicity that you speak of JavaScript,
yeah,
is this something intrinsic to JavaScript, or did this come about in the later revisions?
No. So I think actually I had mentioned this in the second week lectures, right? I mean, JavaScript, because of its nature, the fact that it was meant to be used on browsers, right from the beginning, people wanted it to be such, written in such a way, or rather the language to have features such that it should not block the browser unnecessarily. Okay. So because that was sort of important factor to keep in mind while designing the language, right from the beginning, you will see that this notion of asynchronous interaction was there. Okay. But the whole idea of sort of retrieving data using fetch from URLs and so on started becoming popular only around 2004 or thereabouts. That's when it really took off, which means that from that point onwards, JavaScript had this whole idea of asynchrony. Okay.
All right, sir.
So, yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah. Now,
I understand, sir.
Yeah. See, the idea of asynchronous operation is not unique to JavaScript. There are many languages, especially today, that do have this concept of asynchrony, right? And they are used in different contexts. I mean, primarily, they need to sort of make use of the fact that anything which is long running versus anything which needs user response or user interaction, they should not sort of conflict with each other. Okay.
Yes, sir. Got it. Thanks.
All right. Okay. So what I'm going to do next is to look at this framework called Vue. Okay. So Vue is VUE, right? I mean, it's pronounced Vue, but it's written VUE. And it has nothing to do with the, the view in model view controller, although it does follow a sort of model view controller type of approach to how you can update and display things. Of course, I think some people say that it's not model view controller. It's supposed to be some variant of that, but you can understand it in similar concepts, at least. Okay. Now, the important thing about Vue is that it is basically, you can think of it as a set of extra library functions on top of JavaScript. So it's not a new language by itself. It's not something which is fundamentally different. What it's doing is it's using some of the core ideas of JavaScript, but providing you with a sort of cleaner interface, right, that allows you to do certain kinds of front-end development more easily. Okay. So to understand what exactly that is, the best thing to do, of course, is to look at examples, right? So let me bring up some examples. I'll close these other windows to avoid any confusion. And yes, so once again, after all, Vue is also JavaScript. I mean, it's based on JavaScript, right? So the HTML file over there looks very similar to what you would have in the case of JavaScript, right? Now, I've got rid of the style over here, but I didn't do that to sort of make it look as though this is a shorter file or anything of that sort. I just found that it wasn't very convenient to use those classes, so I left it out. One thing you'll notice is that in the header itself, I'm loading this Vue.js, the core library. Okay. And that's pretty much all that is required in order to get Vue into the system. But my actual script is down here, right? Now, Would it work if both were in the header? I'm not entirely sure of that. I think that, the script that gets executed has to be inside the body. So I've kept it over there as it is. Okay. Now, you'll again find that, there is a span. Instead of next, I'm calling it a head message, right? And you will notice that I'm actually using something new over here. It's something which says vHTML equals head message, right? We'll get to what that is in a moment. But the important thing over here is on this line 10, right? I'm declaring a div. Okay. Effectively, the way that Vue works is to take everything which is inside some specified div in your some specified element inside your HTML page and apply Vue functionality onto that. Okay. The usual thing is to declare it as a div, give it an ID. And once you have given the ID to that particular div, Vue will take over and, replace everything which is there inside that ID. Now, what is there? Once again, just like in the case of the JavaScript example, I declare a table, I have the rows, I declare all the 0, 1, 2, and so on. Okay. Could I have done this better? Could I have just created written of nested for loops in JavaScript that generate all the output for you? Yes. I mean, bottom line is yes, that could be done, right? In this case, it was simple enough that it was not worth the trouble, right? I mean, I can focus more on the remaining parts of it. So the table row, table data, all are well-known things. This tick that we have over here is something new. Okay, so it's not a normal HTML tag, right? It is clearly something which did not exist before. And it is something which I have written for using Vue. Let's take a look and try and understand what it does. So all that is contained inside this Tic-Tac-Toe Vue.js file, right? And that file essentially contains a fair amount of logic. Okay. But if you look at it, large parts of the logic are essentially just fairly fixed, similar to what was already there in the Python and JavaScript versions. Okay. Now let's ignore this initial part, this line 1 to 15, right? And focus on line 16, where I'm creating the new Vue app. Okay. And what I do is I specify that it is a new Vue app. There is one element called EL, right? So this is basically, look at what is being given here. I'm passing in an object to the Vue function, right? The Vue constructor, right? So this new means that this is a class, right? Vue is a class. And this new basically means that I'm creating a new instance of this particular class, associating it with the element which has the ID app, okay, which is what I have over here, right? The div ID equal to app is what I need to specify as the EL out here. And apart from that, there are a few different sort of, parameters that this object that is passed into Vue needs to have. One of them is called data, which is basically the data corresponding to this particular application. And as you can imagine, that data is now the board and the next value. Okay. Whatever we had declared as globals in the Python and JavaScript now are not globals. They belong to this particular Vue instance. Okay. What about the methods inside it? Now it turns out that methods are things that can be called on this particular Vue instance, right? And I will see that, there are places where I'm going to explicitly call this particular method, setVal, for instance. Okay. So when I want to set one particular value, right, I'm going to go in there and have this thing basically calling the setVal with I, which is I is 0, 1, 2, 3 up to 8. Okay. And what it will do is it will once again check whether something called this.result is equal to 0, right? Which means that the game is still in progress. If it is, it will check if the particular board entry is 0. And if it is, then it will basically say this.board of I is equal to this.next. Okay. Ideally, this line should just have been this.board of I is equal to this.next. Okay. But you'll be wondering, okay, so why use this particular, why is this line alone a bit more complicated, right? Ideally, I should have had something which looks like This should have been sufficient. In fact, this is what I initially wrote and then struggled around with it for a little while until I finally realized that Vue does not work with this. It turns out that is something to do with the way that Vue implements what is called reactivity. Okay. Vue is looking for any changes in variables, and it sort of puts in extra logic which says that anytime a variable changes, something needs to get updated. Okay. And it turns out that for arrays, that doesn't work the way that you would normally expect it to. Which is why for arrays, you need to have this explicit, this Vue.set functionality being called. Okay. It's a small sort of gotcha that you have over there that you need to keep in mind, right? So we will ignore that. We will get rid of it, right? And basically the next thing, this dot next at least can just be given as minus this dot next. You can use the normal logic that you are used to, and it works as you would expect. Okay. Now we come to an interesting thing, which is these two things called the computed functions. Okay. Or computed parameters. And what we are saying is that I have two things that are computed. One of them is this head message. Okay. Where does head message go? I can see it over here in my index.html, right? Inside, it should come inside this span, right? Whatever is the value of head message should get reflected inside the span. And what I'm saying is I'm declaring it as a computed function, which means that if anything over here, anything on the system changes, right? This function will be called and the value of the message that gets returned over here will be updated. So when will anything change? It will change anytime that this dot next changes. Okay. So in other words, what Vue does is it performs what is effectively called a data flow analysis and says that under what conditions can this head message change? Right? It looks through this entire logic which is there inside this head message and says, okay, look, the only variable that I'm looking at over here is this dot next, which means that anytime this dot next changes, I need to go in there and recompute the value of head message. Okay. Now this kind of analysis saying that I look at what and all is being used inside this function. Oh, sorry, there is one more thing. This dot result is also something that needs to be checked. Okay, so this dot next and this dot result. These are the two values that need to be checked. If either one of them changes, head message needs to be recomputed. Okay. What is this dot result? That is one more computed function. What does it do? It basically checks whether anything on this dot board, once again, I do the summation and check whether X1 or O1 or game is still in progress or it's a draw, right? Essentially, anytime the board value changes, it will go back, recompute this and update the value of result. Whenever result changes, that in turn will go and update the value of head message. Okay, that's all. I don't need to say when to compute the value of head message, when to compute the value of result. I don't need to go in there and explicitly call those functions one by one, right? Vue automatically takes care of making sure that the functions get called when required and at no other time, right? And that is a key thing. This is where declarative programming has come into the picture. I was able to just specify that result is this function. It's a computed function. Head message is another computed function, right? And this is the actual data corresponding to my application, right? And this is my HTML code. Automatically, Vue says, oh, I have bound this value pos equal to 0 over here, right? I need to go and update this tick element with something, okay? And what is that something? That is declared up in the top part of the JavaScript code. Tick is something called a component, right? Which is basically, you can think of it as, I'm defining a new custom HTML tag. All that I'm saying is it has a certain property, right, which is passed in as props, which in this case is called pos, right, the position, right, which will have a value between 0 to 8. What does it do? It basically outputs some HTML corresponding to what the component should look like. it has its own method, one which is called setVal, which in turn calls the setVal function of the parent, which is the actual Vue app. And it also has a computed function, which is this imgl, which, it's the image link that needs to go in over here. Now, is this really the most efficient way of writing Vue code? Quite frankly, no, not at all, right? I just wrote this because I wanted to sort of show that, yes, you can have the basic ideas of reactivity, right? This idea that this VHTML will get updated with head message automatically. Similarly, this component will update its value automatically without ever having to call that explicitly. Okay. But after this, we will look at a slightly more Vue-ish manner of writing this code, which will make it a bit more clear, and you can see what the purpose of this whole thing is. So let's see what happens when I try loading this page, right? I can basically go to vue/index.html. Now it pretty much looks exactly the same as my JavaScript code, right? And once again, when I do this behavior-wise also, it's exactly the same. Okay. And you can see that it pretty much has all the same functionality, right? The one thing that I left out, I had forgotten to implement actually, was how do I start a new game, right? I should have ideally added a button over here, which allows it to sort of reset and start a new game. I didn't do that. Instead, I can just reload the page and I'll be done with it. Okay. So, the same kind of functionality as before works over here as well. And it's a draw. Okay. Once again, exactly the same constraints as what happened in JavaScript. There is no server-side state. Everything is maintained on the client. If I open another page, then I will effectively have another game running over there, right? The only real difference between this and the original JavaScript version is the fact that I now have this component called tick. And some of these elements, at least, I can see that, head message, result, and so on, that concept of declarative programming has come into the picture over here. I was able to just declare that, the head message should change whenever result changes, right? And it will automatically be computed and updated. I don't need to tell it that every time next is changed or every time the result changes, go and compute head message. The framework will find that out for itself. Okay. So this is pretty much everything. I am also going to show you the last version using a little bit more sort of, what we would call idiomatic Vue, right? Where it means that it is more in keeping with the way of writing a code in the Vue style. Okay, so that's the next thing. If there are any questions, we can take that now, or I can go and finish that. Okay, so let me go through that. It's very similar, so it's worth sort of looking at that as well. Two things you will notice. One is that now suddenly there is a lot of CSS styling over here. The reason for that is, nothing to do with Vue itself. It's just that this is a different way of implementing the table, or rather, the output. What I'm saying is, instead of having a table, I'm going to use a completely different way of rendering the tic-tac-toe grid by using something in CSS, which is called flex, right? And essentially what it says is that the board is going to be displayed using some flex parameter. It will try and put as many entries as possible within the width of the board. Yeah, within the width of this board. And once it fills up within the width of the board, what it will do is it will wrap around to the next row. Okay. And what are we going to put within that board? I'm going to put in a number of different cells, right? And I'm specifying the width and height of the cell, also the border around the cell. And what you will notice is that the width of this 48 pixels, right, multiplied by 3 plus the borders is just under 156 pixels. Okay. So I've chosen this width and height so that I can ensure that after 3 such cells have been put into one line, it will automatically sort of go down to the next line and thereby automatically create a grid without me even having to create a 3x3 table, right? But look at the app, the body part of it. Now this has got simplified even more, right? Even much less than what was there in the JavaScript. I just have one entity called board. Okay. Yeah, there's a question here. Yeah, I mean, this particular code I will be putting on GitLab. I mean, I have it on GitLab. I will be sharing it for sure. Keep in mind that, these are not necessarily the most optimal codes. So what I'm expecting from all of you is that you use this as a starting point, use it to sort of get a flavor for how this works, but then experiment with it and then go out and learn what are the best ways of writing certain styles of code. Okay. All right, let's get back to this. So obviously the app itself is contained in this ttt-comp, right? This JavaScript file. Now I have defined one component called tick, right? Which has a property called val. And it has just that property and a template, right? The template basically shows some HTML output. And then I have a component called board, right? Where you will notice that I have something which basically says that the board has its own data, but instead of the data just being declared as an object, that's declared as a function. Okay. Why exactly is this done is a little bit tricky. It's mentioned in the Vue documentation, right? That if you want a component to sort of carry a copy of its own code along with it, then you need to declare it as a function. Okay. You need to sort of understand a little bit about how Vue works internally in order to understand exactly why this happens. For the time being, we are sort of going to just take it as given and move on. What does the board do? It also has a corresponding template where all that I do is I basically create a class board top. Inside that class, there is this head message, and there is a class called board, right? Which I just use a v-for loop and create tick components inside it. Okay. So if you look at it, all that it does is this tick, this colon val that I have over here is equivalent to, the v-bind colon val equal to and so on. This is just a shortcut that is used in Vue. Similarly, this @click is a shortcut for v on colon click equal to and so on, right? It makes it a little bit easier to write. So we are using those shortcuts and writing the code this way. Okay. So the template for this, if you look at it, will just basically generate this div out here. What are the methods associated with this board? Essentially just this one method, right? Update, which checks the value of result. If the board, this board.i is equal to 0, it calls view.set for this board and updates the value of this .next. Okay. You will notice that I'm not calling a function to update the result or do anything else over here. As before, I have a computed message, right? I have this head message and I have the result, and that's it, right? So I don't have anything else sort of going in here. I don't need to sort of look at any of the other logic. I just declare each thing as what it should be, right? And at the end, I create this app, right? And what happens when I try running it? I find that if I open this index2.html, now it looks slightly different. I'm no longer using the images. I'm just using X and O directly, right? But you see that it has already formed a grid, which looks more or less the same as before. What happens when I click here? The same functionality, right? Once again, if I click on something that's already been clicked, it doesn't work because it's doing that check whether this .board is equal to 0, right? And by doing this, I can go through and implement the entire thing. Yeah, it just says boring draw and stops over here, right? Now, once again, I have to reload the page in order to move on, right? If I reload midway through, it resets, right? All of that similar to the JavaScript functionality. Okay. So the question that you might finally ask is, what was the need for all of this, right? Why go through this entire thing of creating components, creating a component inside a component, right? Why am I doing all of this? The real elegance of Vue comes out when you start looking at reusing components. Okay, and what do I mean by reusing components? Let's go look in the index.html, right? And I have this line board over here. All I'm going to do is create one more copy of this board. Okay. And let's see what happens when I now run it. When I load the page, it now shows me 2 grids. I can play 2 games simultaneously. Okay. So almost nothing was required over here in order to achieve this functionality, right? I can have one game completed, the other game becomes a draw, right? Midway through, if I sort of reload each one of them, then both of them are gone, right? It just gets back to the original state in both, right? It doesn't matter whether one was completed or not. All I have is that, each one sort of progresses independent of the other. Okay. So what happened is we effectively created a component called a board, which I could now just create, just instantiate it somewhere. This is the ultimate in sort of object orientation, right? I've created an object which stands by itself and just put it somewhere in the user interface, and it takes care of everything. It knows how to manage the styling. It knows the size of the font. Everything is self-contained. Even the logic associated with it is self-contained, right? So if I wanted, for example, to implement multiple, let's say, chessboards that could be played one after the other, right? This looks like a really neat way of doing it. And interestingly enough, for those of you who are interested in chess, the website chess.com, which is one of the big sort of online chess things, they are built on top of Vue. Okay. Now, it's not that Vue is the only framework that can do this. Obviously, there are others also that achieve very similar kinds of results. Vue turns out to be simple and clean enough that we can use it in order to illustrate these ideas. Okay, so that's pretty much it from me now. Yes, so I'm open to doubts. Amol, yes, you have a doubt.
Yeah, so in the Vue code,
yeah,
somewhere I saw a variable towards the bottom with a var. Any specific reason why we are using var and not a let there?
Wait, unlikely. I don't think I used var anywhere. Might have been val.
Okay.
Like, yeah,
okay.
Because yeah, I mean, see, in general, I don't use var. Yeah, so I tend to avoid using var for the simple reason, as mentioned in the previous lectures, scoping rules with var are tricky. So it doesn't really help to declare anything as var. Let and const were sort of brought in purely to sort of fix problems with that, right? So yeah, that's basically it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, this yeah, it's interesting. I guess some of you do play chess, and chess.com does use it. The funny thing is, of course, that you go look at the page source of something like chess.com, right? And you don't really see very much out there, in the sense that you're not going to see anything with Vue. I think you'll sort of have to look through it, the logic, to find out that there is something with Vue being loaded at some point. Right? Part of that is because a lot of this code is pre-rendered on the server side, and sort of only minimized versions of the JavaScript are sent out to the users. That's basically for performance reasons. Okay, so all right, there's a question. How does the reactivity affect the idea of you mean descriptive or declarative programming? Because I'm not sure what descriptive programming is. Declarative programming is, yeah, so declarative programming pretty much relies on the idea of reactivity, right? I mean, in some sense, it is sort of saying that I should be able to just declare where each thing is. And in some sense, the thing will take care of updating itself, right? And that's more or less what I have over here. I have 2 boards. I just put them onto the screen, right? I just put them into my HTML page. And the entire logic for what needs to happen, when something needs to get updated, when it should sort of react to a click or to something else on the screen, is all taken care of internally. Okay, so that is the sense in which Vue is sort of helping with this kind of declarative programming. Can we minify the code in Vue.js, or do we need separate frameworks? I mean, minification is something else. I would not really want to talk about that right now. See, minifying is used only to make the amount of data sent over the network less. So in fact, if you look at the code that I have written here, right, this index.html, right, this script that I'm loading on line 22, this is actually the development version, right? And when you're using it in production, they themselves recommend a slightly different link to use, which is already minified. Okay, which sort of has a sort of more compact version of the code. But if you're really trying to optimize, then there are even other things. For example, Vue has some kind of a compilation process, which will allow you to get only the parts that you need, at least to some extent, and put those together into different files that can be used. All of that is right now more or less beyond the scope of what we are trying to do. So I'm not sort of getting into any of that at the moment. There is another raised hand. Sorry, I'm not able to see who's raised the hand. So please go ahead and ask. I think Kumar had a hand raised.
Hi, sir. Good evening.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the right now reusability you was talking about that in the code,
yeah.
the Vue.js. Yeah. So here, since we are not doing anything, we are playing on the browser. Suppose I want to store that information for temporary purpose. That suppose two user is playing,
yeah.
two different group is playing, two. And that and we use that the functionality, but we want to save on the server somewhere.
Correct.
In that case, how can we handle this?
No, I mean, that's a very relevant question. See, in fact, if you look at it, chess.com must be doing pretty much exactly the same thing, right? They can't be running purely on the client. What would normally happen is that the on-click function, instead of just being something which goes and updates your local display, will be something that actually results in a call to the server, right? Telling it to update the state that is being stored on the server side, right? And then the server will acknowledge with something, say, which will then be reflected in the UI. So that is where this sort of AJAX kind of thing, the asynchronous JavaScript, and comes into the picture. I have not got into that yet. We will be looking at it later to some extent.
Yeah. So can I ask one more question here?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought about that. Something we can do asynchronous or the AJAX way. But the question is that when we send any post or any request to the server, so we need to change its name or the something ID. So since we simply wrote the block and reusable, we use reuse that. So everything, even its ID, its name, everything will be copied the same way.
No, that I agree. So, I mean, I sort of created this only as a toy example, just to sort of say that, you can sort of reuse blocks like this. But when you are making requests and you want to be able to update one specific element, you will need more information about the block, which block is being updated and so on.
I have to distinguish that between some way.
Correct. Yeah. No, I mean, this is definitely a toy example. It's not exactly the right thing to do that. But yeah, in practice, you will need a lot more. So this was mostly, just to sort of a flashy demonstration that, you can very easily reuse a component. But in practice, you will need more than that.
Okay. Actually, I was confused to thinking about that. Now clear. Okay.
Yeah. I will. My problem is I have not made that GitLab link public yet. I need to just check on a couple of things before I do that. We will send it out, right? So by end of today itself, yeah, it will definitely be posted on the course portal. I think that would be the best way to do it. Okay, there's a question. Can we make a different play again button for different game? Like if we play again one game that doesn't affect the state of the other? You can. I mean, that's up to you, right? I mean, now that you know how the thing is implemented, it's entirely up to you to try different examples. And I would strongly recommend you try, right? If you can get some kind of things of that sort, that's the best way to learn, right? So, like, in the previous question, one of the things you will need to keep in mind over there is now you have two games going on. How are you going to keep each game's data separate from the other? If you have like one JavaScript with one global variable, then, whatever you have in one thing will just get reflected in the other one as well. Right. So things of that sort are what you will need to keep in mind. How do I sort of associate the local data for each board with itself? How do I make sure they don't sort of stamp on each other? How can I create sort of multiple parallel things? How do I reflect this data onto the server so that, if I need to reload or if I need to go away and come back at some other point, will it still retain the state? All of those are interesting things to see moving forward. Right? The updating to the server is something that we will look at later, but the other things like how do I play a new board or something of that sort is something you can even think about and try to implement on your own. Okay, any other questions?
One thing, sir, is that class over or today's class or the
Yes, today's class is over. Yes, sorry. So I'm done with the material for now. So if there are no other questions, we can break. Of course, feel free to think about it, and questions can come up on discourse also later. But,
I have a couple of questions. Yeah. So the first question is that whatever we learning right now,
yeah.
So the way the Vue was updating the thing and it's changing the heading and everything automatically.
Yeah.
So it is not making sense that how and where it is happening, because I'm completely dependent that structure of the Vue. And suppose we do from the JavaScript, we know we are doing that. But in the Vue, the changing, the things automatically changing. It's kind of, we have to remember or the something like that, because we don't know how it's internally happening.
No, see, I would not think of it that way. Think of Vue as just a sort of library of JavaScript. It is providing extra functionality to JavaScript, which allows you to program in a certain way, right? I mean, see, in Python, for example, there are modules for everything, right? For example, there is a module that can be used to parse CSV files, right? So how do we use that? We basically call csv.file reader or something like that. And then we say that, look, it will automatically take care of doing the comma separated reading, and it will make sure that, if there is any special characters, it will mask them out properly. Certain things it will take care of on its own, right? So that's how we use a module in Python. Same way, Vue is also sort of a module in JavaScript that can be used for some specific kinds of functionality. The point is, it provides you with this way of looking at the code, which is reactive, right? Which means that you can now focus on basically, deciding what to put where on the screen, and just specifying how the functionality should update, rather than, saying, okay, I need to keep track of each and everything and go and recompute things on their own individually, right? So this idea of building components and reusing them is what Vue permits. But yes, at the end of the day, it is just, Vue is also JavaScript. Okay? The entire thing, Vue is written in JavaScript. And if you go look into the Vue internals, right, the Vue documentation and all that, it tells you about how it is actually taking your JavaScript code and sort of, modifying the functionality so that this reactive behavior can be put in, right? There's really no magic there. I mean, well, of course there is, it looks like magic, but the point is that, ultimately what is reactive code? It has to look for whenever there are changes in certain values, and then go and recompute certain things. And once those things are recomputed, it has to go and redraw certain parts of the screen. What Vue does is all of that thing, finding out which are the things which changed, what are the new values, and what to redraw on the screen. All of that it does by itself without you having to worry about it. Okay. So, React does the same thing. Angular has some parts that do something similar. So all of them are ultimately trying to sort of take that part of, having to worry about what gets displayed on the screen and hide it from the programmer, hide it from the person who's developing. Just increases your productivity. That's all.
Correct. I think it leaves you to just maintain the data and logic. Don't worry about drawing this on the screen.
Hey, thanks, Tej, by the way. So, feel free to add anything else. I wasn't sure if you were on the call, but yeah, good that you are also here. Sorry, there's one more question. In compvue.js, when you made another board tag, the two Tic-Tac-Toe games were running independent. Does that imply that Vue, we can have multiple instances of the same task? See, that's what I said. It's not exactly the same task. Each of these board components, right? If I go look at the JavaScript, each board component has its own data associated with it. Okay. Let me actually just try something, something I'm not sure if it will work, but I would like to try it anyway. I believe that this will, oh no, something else happened.
Probably you wanted to assign it to an object or a variable and then return that variable.
Yeah, I just wanted to have it as a variable directly instead of having it as a function. I was looking at something in the Vue documentation which said that if it was directly a variable, then essentially the multiple instances would share the same value. Is that correct? I'm not entirely sure of that. Okay, I don't know, so I would rather not get into that right now. But yeah, the point is that this board component has the data associated with it, right? Which means that it is now carrying its own data along with it, right? Which means that when I call update on this particular instance, it goes and updates only this particular code.
Correct. I think that's the use of this here. This dot is this specific data and this specific board. So actually in the HTML, when you create a board, each one you can assume that it's like a new object being created or new instance being created and everything in and around that is created.
Yeah. One question, why is reactivity so important? See, it's at the bottom line, it is just a question of convenience in some sense, right? It allows you as the developer to focus on what your UI what the behavior should be, rather than how that behavior is to be achieved. You can sort of specify the different looks of different parts of the thing and not worry about how to go about updating each part of the screen.
Correct. And also I think historically web has been delivering documents which were like pretty much static, and at some point web also became an application platform, right? At that point they introduced cookies to maintain their session, they introduced many things, and this is like the next level where we are trying to add more to the ecosystem to make that application delivery much easier. If you're just doing a simple document, you didn't need any of this, but we are actually trying to build an application which appears and feels like a desktop application. So that's where all this comes into picture.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I mean, right, exactly. When the web was only dealing with documents, you did not need reactivity. You need reactivity when you want the thing to sort of respond to certain functionality that you have. Which approach should be first view? First view approach or second approach? I mean, are you talking about the two examples that I showed over here with Vue? I would say yes, the second is better, right? And simply because it is sort of more component oriented and sort of uses the ideas of Vue a bit more systematically, right? That you can compose components one inside the other. You can sort of build the system properly out of components. That's ultimately the way that you should be looking at it. The first one is just, making use of the fact that Vue has basic reactivity, but it's not really, not doing anything more than that. There was one more question from Himanshu, I think, about Svelte. Now, Svelte is a different framework, right? It also achieves very similar kinds of things in terms of reactivity and so on, but it uses a compiler-based approach, meaning that it is ultimately, Vue can be used in multiple ways. It can be used directly like a library that I pulled in. That's what I have done over here. Or you can, try to construct a Vue application using the command line and, do all of that stuff. Whereas with Svelte, you have to pretty much write everything in Svelte, run it through the compiler, and then load it. But it is probably optimized better in some ways, at least. Okay. It looks like a very interesting framework. There are lots of people who feel that it's a very nice way to go. But the fundamental principles are, again, the same. It is also building on reactivity. How does a browser deal with custom tags? Okay, how does it deal with custom tags? I think that's part of the HTML5 spec at this point, that if there is a custom tag, then it has to be handled so that web component functionality allows JavaScript to register handlers for custom tags. Because
correct. I think more thing would be to look into web components, and it's somewhat similar. Yeah.
So, I mean, unless you have sort of explicitly registered some kind of handler for a custom tag, Java HTML will actually, the browser should ignore tags that it doesn't know, right? So if you use some arbitrary tag that you have created and you don't have any JavaScript to work on it, it will just get ignored. It's as though the tag isn't there at all. And the reason for that is simply because browsers have been designed to be sort of very forgiving, right? I mean, the approach that they take is that they will just ignore everything, and anything, there are no errors, or rather it hides errors as much as possible. Okay. Sorry, any further questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
This question is that in the screencast, there's a talk about that one concept like that two-way binding. So
yes,
true.
So two-way, what is the actually use of that and how actually it is work? Because I tested that thing. Suppose there is a function defined in the something Vue.js, and there was a one input in the browser and another display on the browser. So I am taking the three things. One is the input on the browser, another is display on the browser, and one is the function defined in the Vue.js. So whenever I change that something in the browser, in the input, the two things changes as the display as well as simultaneously in the Vue.js data. And I change in the Vue.js data through the console. It is also changed as well as that input and the display. So
correct. That's why it's called two-way binding. So in the usual things, what we have is, you have the data. If you change the data, the content of the div or content of the span changes, correct? So that's like a one way of, changing, where you change the data and the content of the div changes. The other way is, we have input elements. I'm not talking about click as an input here. I'm talking about form inputs, for example, text box or a drop down or whatever. When you bind that to actually a data input, it becomes two-way. If you change the data, it changes the actually contents of the input. For example, let's say you have a drop down and a data attached to that drop down. If you change the data now, the drop down value in the drop down changes, or if you change the drop down, the value inside the data changes. So that's why it's called two-way binding. Okay. And that's very useful, right? For example, in code somewhere you wanted to reset the value of the drop down. For example, some error happened and you want to reset the value of the drop down. Now all you need to change is the data in the thing, and it will change all the corresponding drop downs or inputs. You don't have to worry about changing them.
Okay, so the input to that input to the Vue.js, it is the two-way connection. What about that message in the Vue.js and the display about the double curly bracket in the browser? So this is the one way only, no?
Correct. That's just a template change. Yeah, because I don't think you will change. That's just a template. That's one way. Yeah, it's just a binding there. Yeah.
Okay. So okay. So it is very interesting thing. We can use many places according to our convenience.
Correct. So I think you should know the concept of both, and you could use whichever is relevant.
Okay. Yes, it is look like. So this type of concept, there is a no exist. There is a no in the Jinja or the Flask. This type of concept exists, no?
See, I think Jinja and Flask works the very server side, right? There's no actual user interaction at that point. The advantage with the JavaScript is it runs in your browser where there is user and he is doing something. for Jinja to like have any input, it should actually come to browser, but all the rendering of the Jinja happens on the server side.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
So whatever, even the asynchronous way something is happening, and if we are typing something on the input, then it displays some other places in the browser, not in the input itself.
Not in the
Input like that. In the Vue.js, I tried to change the data in the Vue.js through code. It was changing even the inside the input content. So it was
correct.
quite amazing.
Correct. I mean, that's the magic part, but that's how it's supposed to happen.
Okay.
That's the two-way binding. Yeah.
Okay, now it is clear. Thank you.
There's one other question. Doesn't the browser just directly print unrecognized HTML text? I'm not entirely sure. I think if you have, a tag that it doesn't know about, it should probably just, it just prints something over there and ignores the tags around it, right? So it's not going to show you the tag, but it'll print out whatever is inside the tag. But yeah, like I said, this is just something which decision that was taken early on, that the browser should be as forgiving as possible. Sorry, Tej, I think your audio was breaking.
Sorry, can you show the HTML part for this something?
Yeah, it's just my tag.
Yeah. So if you see, it will escape the tags, but it will just print the contents of the tag.
Yeah.
So it won't know how to handle the my tag / my tag, but it just rest of it just prints it. But my tag and like that tag itself, it just skips it.
Correct. But if I had a Vue component called my tag or a web component or something which is registered as my tag, then it would do whatever is, according to that, whatever template that particular component has would have been displayed instead.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. And I guess we can close the session now. Like I said earlier, we generally do sort of monitor the discourse, or if at all we have not seen it, then one of the others would alert us if there is something that we need to look at. So please feel free to continue the conversations there, and we'll close for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you.